Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The beaches of Normandy live in the world's imagination as a theater of courage, sacrifice, and triumph. You can picture it even now. Gray dawn, restless waves, rows of landing craft grinding forward through the surf, young soldiers clutching their rifles as steel ramps crashed open and the storm of history swept them ashore. For most people, this is the story of D-Day. The Allied perspective, the desperate climb up the beaches, the men who carried democracy on their backs through fire and sand. Yet behind this iconic narrative lies another, quieter story, one largely lost to silence. The men who defended those same beaches have been left in the shadows. Their experiences are rarely told, dismissed as unworthy of remembrance, swallowed up by the stigma of fighting for a regime steeped in brutality and tyranny. To tell their story is not to sympathize with the Nazi cause, but to uncover the human reality buried beneath the myth. Hunger, fear, exhaustion, and the sobering knowledge that history was about to sweep them aside. As historian Robert M. Citino once remarked, the Allied landings became one of the great heroic epics of the modern age, while the German experience was reduced to little more than the image of a defeated army, stripped of glory and condemned to silence. And yet, history is never so simple. In every bunker, on every dune, were young men, some barely 17, others already scarred from years of fighting, who had no illusions about the task before them. Some were fanatical believers, others weary conscripts, and many were not even German at all. Together they faced the longest day knowing they were outmatched, but bound by duty, fear, or coercion to hold their ground. This is the untold perspective, the story of Normandy seen through the eyes of those who stood on the wrong side of history. It is a perspective often uncomfortable to explore, but one that deepens our understanding of how war consumes not only nations and causes, but individuals. For every Allied soldier who leapt into the surf, there was a German defender in a bunker, tightening his grip on a machine gun, waiting for the inevitable. Before we can enter their world, before we can see the battle as they saw it, we must return to the tense months of waiting when the Atlantic wall stood as both a fortress and a fragile illusion. A storm was coming. Everyone knew it. The only questions were where and when. By the autumn of 1943, the German High Command knew that the invasion of Western Europe was no longer a question of if, but when. Hitler himself, in a tense meeting with his generals, declared that all signs pointed to an Allied offensive no later than the spring of 1944. His words hung heavy over the room. To his officers, it was not prophecy, but inevitability, an enemy across the channel gathering men, ships, and resolve. Yet spring came, and nothing happened. The beaches lay quiet, the gulls wheeling above the Atlantic surf, while German soldiers manned their posts in uneasy anticipation. Each passing week without an invasion made the waiting worse. The silence was its own form of torture, for it meant the Allies were still preparing, still amassing, still perfecting a blow that everyone sensed would be shattering when it finally fell. On the Atlantic coast, the tension seeped into daily life. For the ordinary soldier stationed in a bunker or trench, the days dragged in monotony, repairing fortifications, stringing barbed wire, clearing debris after storms, and staring endlessly across the gray waters toward England. Rumors circulated in whispers. The enemy would land in Brittany, or perhaps in Normandy, or most certainly near Calais. No one could agree, and so every soldier felt that his stretch of coastline might become the axis on which the war would turn. This uncertainty weighed even heavier because the Germans had seen what Allied landings looked like before. The Mediterranean campaigns at Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio had proven that Anglo-American forces were learning, adapting, and striking with growing precision. Veterans of those battles, now stationed on the Atlantic wall, carried with them memories of thunderous naval barrages and endless skies filled with bombers. They knew the Allies would not simply test the coast, they would come with everything. And so, men smoked more than usual, wrote longer letters home, and carried the gnawing thought that they might never see their families again. In Paris, far from the front, life under occupation seemed deceptively normal. Cafes still served coffee substitutes, black market goods still flowed through narrow streets. But along the beaches of Normandy, in the bunkers beneath the dunes, The atmosphere was different. There, time felt like it was coiling tighter and tighter, waiting to snap. The soldiers' superiors did what they could to prepare them, but preparation without certainty often felt hollow. Each morning, the tide rolled in and out as it always had, and each evening, the western horizon glowed faintly with the lights of unseen England. The calm was an illusion. Everyone knew it. The storm would break. It was only a matter of when and how hard. If the soldiers on the Atlantic Wall felt unease, the same was true for the men who commanded them. Germany's defense of Western Europe was not a seamless machine, but a house divided. At the center of the argument stood two field marshals, Gerd von Rundstedt, the seasoned elder statesman of the Wehrmacht, and Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox. Both were decorated, both trusted in their own instincts, and both were utterly convinced the other was wrong. Von Rundstedt, born of Prussian tradition, believed in depth. He argued that the panzer divisions, the sharp edge of Germany's counterattack, should be kept inland, positioned to strike once the Allies revealed their hand. In his eyes, to scatter tanks along the coast would waste their power. Better to lure the enemy onto the beaches and then smash them with a concentrated blow. It was the way Germany had always fought. Maneuver, timing, the sudden counterstroke. Rommel disagreed with every fiber of his being. His North African campaigns had taught him brutal lessons. Without air superiority, tanks were little more than burning coffins once they moved in open country. The Luftwaffe was now stretched thin, its strength consumed on the Eastern Front. Rommel argued that the only chance to repel the invasion was to strike at the enemy as they came ashore, before they could establish a foothold. To do otherwise, he warned, was to let the Allies pour across France unopposed. Their debates grew sharper as the months passed. Rundstedt, urbane and weary, considered Rommel's urgency reckless. Rommel, fiercely energetic, found Rundstedt's caution indistinguishable from fatalism. Both men carried the weight of experience, yet their experiences pulled them in opposite directions. The Atlantic Wall became not just a physical line of defense, but a reflection of this fractured German command. Bunkers built, obstacles planted, tanks waiting, but never where all agreed they should be. And behind their disagreement lurked another force, Hitler himself. The Führer often intervened directly, issuing contradictory orders, changing his mind with the tides of paranoia. Neither Rommel nor Rundstedt could fully implement his vision. Their quarrel was never fully resolved, and by June 1944, the German High Command faced the most decisive battle of the war without a united plan. To the soldiers on the ground, the debates in Berlin and Paris mattered little. All they saw was confusion. Rumors spread that tanks would come to their aid, someday, somehow. But no one knew when or from where. The defenders would go into battle uncertain not only of the enemy's movements, but of their own leaders' decisions. That uncertainty was, in itself, a wound. For the ordinary soldier manning the bunkers and trenches of the Atlantic Wall, the waiting was unbearable. There was no glory in it, only long days of repairing defenses, staring out at the gray sea, and imagining the storm that would one day sweep toward them. Soldiers found ways to cope, and one of the oldest human shields against fear is humor. Jokes circulated from bunker to bunker, half laughed, half sighed. One quip went like this: "If you see a black plane, it's British. If you see a silver one, it's American. And if you see nothing at all, it's the Luftwaffe." Nervous chuckles followed, for the truth was too plain to ignore. German skies no longer belonged to German pilots. To laugh at their own helplessness was a small act of defiance against despair, but not everyone shared in the laughter. Many of the men stationed along the coast were not German at all. They were Osttruppen, Poles, Ukrainians, Georgians, and Soviet prisoners forced into service by the Reich. Some had been marched hundreds of miles from their homes, given German uniforms, and placed in foreign soil to fight for a cause that was not their own. Their presence was a bitter irony. Men who had once fought against the Nazis now compelled to defend them. These conscripts, exhausted and suspicious of the officers who commanded them, had little interest in making jokes. They were hungry, homesick, and in many cases broken by captivity. Many German veterans, wounded in previous campaigns and deemed unfit for frontline duty, also found themselves stationed here. What resulted was a patchwork army, a blend of the disillusioned, the unwilling, and the unready. And yet, day after day, they worked. They hammered steel into the sand, set mines in the dunes, and dragged timber into the surf. The war machine demanded it, and survival required it. Their laughter, when it came, was fleeting, an attempt to fill the silence, to pretend for a moment that this waiting was not unbearable. For some, the thought of the invasion was almost a relief. At least then the uncertainty would end. Until that day came, the soldiers on the Atlantic coast lived in a twilight world, half soldier, half prisoner of their own anxiety, joking at their own weakness because there was nothing else to do. By early 1944, the mighty Atlantic wall looked imposing on paper. Hundreds of miles of bunkers, artillery positions, and minefields stretching from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. But behind the concrete and barbed wire, the soldiers manning it lived in conditions that spoke less of strength than of slow decay. Supplies were thin, rations inconsistent, and medical stores often non-existent. The Wehrmacht, stretched across a continent, had long since lost its capacity to feed all its soldiers properly. For many defenders, hunger was a constant companion. The story of Paul Goetz, only 17 years old at the time, captures this better than any statistic. "I hadn't had any food or water for 3 days," he later recalled. At dawn on June 6th, desperate and hollow, he wandered into a nearby French village, hoping to find milk. The villagers knew him. He was a boy they had seen before, wearing the uniform of an occupier, but this time they turned him away. "Go away," they told him. "The Allies have already landed with tanks." The cruelty of their words was sharpened by truth. France, weary of occupation, was shifting visibly in its loyalties. Where once many civilians had endured German presence with uneasy politeness, trading goods, offering small kindnesses, they now sensed that liberation was near. The power dynamic had shifted overnight. A hungry boy in uniform was no longer a neighbor, but the face of an army that was collapsing. And Paul was far from alone. Along the coast, countless soldiers felt their bodies weaken from poor diet and exhaustion. Cigarettes, once a staple comfort, had become scarce luxuries. Bread grew stale, meat was rare, and many men lived off watery stews. A German officer noted bitterly in his diary that his men could build fortifications but not fill their stomachs. This hunger ate at morale more effectively than Allied shells ever could. Soldiers who were told they were defending Fortress Europe began to sense that the fortress was hollow. What good were mines, bunkers, and barbed wire if the men inside them lacked the strength to fight? Waiting, underfed, and uncertain, they began to feel the erosion of something deeper than health. They were losing belief, not just in the war, but in their place within it. The storm was coming, and they were to face it on empty stomachs, in uniforms that no longer inspired fear, in villages where the smiles of locals had hardened into cold indifference. As the tide of history crept toward the French coast, one of Germany's most famous commanders was nowhere near the battlefield. Erwin Rommel, hero of the Desert War, the general whose very name struck awe in both Allies and Germans, was at home in Germany. It was June 6, 1944, his wife's birthday, and Rommel had seized the chance to combine family duty with a meeting at Hitler's headquarters. He believed he could return in time. After all, poor weather seemed to guarantee that no invasion would come just yet. This was the bitter irony of D-Day. When the blow finally fell, Rommel was not at his command post, but hundreds of miles away. His absence was not just physical, but symbolic. The entire German command structure seemed adrift at the very moment it needed clarity. Rundstedt, older and cautious, chose not to disturb him. He was convinced the Allied paratroopers who had begun dropping on the night of June 5th were a diversion, a ploy meant to distract the Wehrmacht from the real invasion he still believed would strike at Calais. In war, timing can be everything. On this day, the Germans squandered it. By the time Rommel returned to France on the evening of June 6th, the beaches had already fallen into Allied hands. The greatest amphibious invasion in history had unfolded in his absence, and the fate of the Reich's western defenses had been sealed without him. The tragic sense of inevitability was sharpened by Rommel's own warnings in the months prior. He had begged for reinforcements to be stationed close to the shore, insisted that the enemy must be met at the water's edge, argued that waiting to counterattack would be suicide. Yet on the morning of destiny, the army was paralyzed by caution and misjudgment. The tanks that might have contested the landing sat useless miles inland, unable to move quickly under skies dominated by Allied aircraft. When Rommel finally arrived and saw the reality, his worst fears had already come true. The defenses he had worked so hard to build, the stakes, the mines, the flooded fields, were shattered in hours. The beaches that he had sworn must never be lost were already crawling with Allied tanks, artillery, and soldiers. One man's absence cannot decide a battle alone. But on June 6th, the absence of Rommel and the failure of the German High Command to act decisively meant that the Atlantic Wall never truly had a chance. For months before the invasion, German soldiers bent their backs to the endless labor of fortification. Along the Norman shoreline, they drove timber stakes into the sand, wired tripods meant to tear open the hulls of landing craft, and planted mines where waves would one day break. Concrete bunkers squatted like watchful beasts in the dunes, their narrow embrasures ready to spit fire upon anything approaching from the sea. Streams were dammed and fields deliberately flooded, turning the land behind the beaches into marshes that could bog down advancing troops and armor. This was the Atlantic Wall, or at least the version that existed in Normandy. On maps, it was drawn as a seamless fortress, a chain of steel and concrete stretching for thousands of kilometers. In reality, it was patchwork, strong in some places, thin in others, relying on the sheer willpower of underfed soldiers and hastily placed mines. Still, to those who built it, it felt immense. To the men who stood in its shadow, it was supposed to be the edge of an empire. Much of its design bore Rommel's mark. After studying the disaster of Salerno in 1943, where Allied forces had stormed ashore in Italy, Rommel vowed not to repeat the same mistake. There, the lack of prepared defenses had allowed the enemy to pour into the peninsula almost unhindered. In France, he ordered beaches bristling with obstacles and demanded that every mile of coast be transformed into a trap. If the invasion could not be stopped at the water's edge, he warned, it could never be stopped at all. And yet, even as they built, soldiers wondered, would it truly hold? The Atlantic was wide, but rumors spoke of Allied fleets beyond reckoning, of skies blackened with aircraft, of landing craft rolling off American assembly lines like toys. Each obstacle planted in the sand was a gesture of defiance, but also an admission of fear. At night, when the work was done, soldiers lay awake in the bunkers and asked themselves the question they dared not say aloud in daylight. Would all of this be enough? Could steel, concrete, and barbed wire withstand the weight of an empire determined to break through? It was a question that hung in the salty air of Normandy right up until the night the horizon began to glow with fire. The night of June 5th began like so many others. Gray skies, the slow crash of waves, the steady creak of wooden defenses in the tide. Then, just past midnight, the air itself began to tremble. The drone of engines rolled across the coast, low and unending, until the horizon seemed to pulse with sound. The soldiers of the Atlantic Wall looked up to see the sky filled with bombers, over 2,000 of them, an armada of steel soaring through the night. Searchlights swept frantically back and forth, probing for shadows. Then the bombs began to fall. The earth shook as villages and roads were ripped apart. Fires licked the horizon, barns crumbled, and livestock stampeded in terror. To the defenders huddled in bunkers, the bombardment was both terrifying and confusing. Some fortifications emerged untouched. Others were obliterated in seconds. The effectiveness of the raid would later be debated, but for the men who endured it, there was no debate at all. To them, it felt like the end of the world. And then came the parachutes. First a handful of drifting silhouettes, then hundreds, descending like pale ghosts in the moonlight. Allied paratroopers touched down across the Norman countryside, behind hedgerows, in orchards, and along the flooded fields Rommel had ordered as traps. German soldiers stumbled from their positions to meet them, and firefights broke out in the dark. Muzzles flashed in the hedges, shouts in English, French, and German mingled with cries of the wounded. For hours, the skirmishes raged. Paratroopers cut telephone wires, seized bridges, and blocked roads. The defenders, already rattled by bombs, now found themselves surrounded by enemies materializing from the sky. Many German officers refused to believe this was the real invasion. Rundstedt himself was convinced it was a diversion, a trick to draw forces away from the true landing at Calais. But the soldiers on the ground could not dismiss what they saw with their own eyes. A countryside crawling with foreign troops, determined to carve chaos into the heart of France. As the eastern horizon began to glow faintly with the first hint of dawn, the exhausted defenders thought the worst must surely be behind them. They were wrong. What had come from the sky was only the herald. What waited just beyond the horizon, out on the dark waters of the Channel, was something far larger, and it was moving straight toward them. Dawn broke over Normandy on June 6th with a gray light that seemed, at first, unremarkable. The paratrooper skirmishes still echoed inland, sporadic gunfire, distant shouts, but along the beaches the horizon appeared calm. Then, slowly, shapes began to rise from the mist. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. By the time the sun lifted itself fully into the sky, the defenders saw what no imagination could have prepared them for. An ocean of ships stretched from one end of the horizon to the other. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop carriers, landing craft, thousands of vessels blotting the sea with steel. Overhead, barrage balloons floated like gray sentinels. To the German soldiers, it was as though the Channel itself had become an enemy army, rolling toward them with unstoppable weight. Paul Goetz, the 17-year-old soldier who had wandered for milk only hours before, later remembered the moment with a clarity that never left him. As soon as we walked over the dunes and saw thousands of ships and also landing boats and barrage balloons, I knew the war was lost. For a boy who had already endured hunger and rejection from the French villagers, the sight was the final blow to hope. And then the bombardment began. Naval guns roared with a thunder that shook the dunes, hurling shells into the bunkers and strong points along the coast. Buildings collapsed, dust and smoke boiled upward, and domesticated animals broke free from their pens to run wild through the fields. The defenders clung to their positions, ears ringing, their very sense of reality shattered by the scale of destruction. It was not just the noise, nor even the firepower. It was the realization that the enemy's resources were beyond comprehension. For years, German propaganda had insisted that the Reich's walls were unbreachable. But on this morning, staring at the endless horizon of ships, soldiers could feel the illusion dissolving. Still, duty chained them to their posts. Orders had been given, ammunition was loaded, machine guns were tested and retested. Whatever they felt inside, whatever despair churned in their stomachs, the defenders braced themselves. The moment had come at last. As the naval guns thundered, German soldiers scrambled to their positions. Men who had spent months laying mines and hammering timber now crouched behind the weapons they had prepared, waiting for the silhouettes in the surf to draw near. Machine guns were loaded, flak cannons trained, mortars set to fire. The bunkers, built of cold concrete, became their lifelines, the only shield between them and the storm of steel and men approaching from the sea. The night's chaos had not ended with dawn. Allied paratroopers still harried the defenders inland, cutting telephone lines, seizing crossroads, and spreading confusion with every skirmish. Orders were delayed, sometimes never reaching the men on the front. Squads that had been scattered during the night tried desperately to regroup, stumbling into positions half prepared, often under fire before they could catch their breath. For some, the moment was strangely clarifying. After months of waiting, after weeks of gnawing uncertainty, the fear of when was replaced with the certainty of now. One German staff sergeant, Joseph B., later wrote, "Finally, the hour has come. Although it had to happen and was foreseeable, it impressed me a lot. Of course, it is not a trifle. For sure these hours, the greatest battle is taking place that the world has ever seen. Hopefully fortune is with us now." His words captured the strange mix of resignation and grim determination that hung in the air. When the first landing craft ground against the sand, defenders opened fire. The staccato chatter of MG-42s tore across the beaches, bullets stitching the surf. Mortar shells arced overhead, bursting among the ranks of men wading through water and sand. Some attackers fell, others pushed forward, the weight of numbers driving them on. For every soldier who faltered, another seemed to appear in his place. Inside the bunkers, German gunners pressed their faces to the narrow firing slits, watching wave after wave surge ashore. They fired until barrels glowed red, until smoke filled their lungs, until hands shook from the recoil. Each man knew he was a single thread straining against a rising tide. Yet still, they fought, because the alternative, surrender, collapse, dishonor, was unthinkable. The clash was no longer an abstraction, no longer the stuff of rumors or propaganda. It was flesh and blood, steel and fire, unfolding before their eyes. The greatest invasion in history had begun, and the defenders of the Atlantic Wall were its first victims and its first witnesses. The battle for the beaches was not fought with rifles alone. When the first waves of American infantry pressed inland, they brought with them weapons designed specifically to root defenders out of concrete. For the men inside the bunkers, it was a nightmare they had always half expected, yet nothing could prepare them for the reality. Flamethrowers were among the most feared. A long hiss, the roar of ignition, and then a torrent of fire would pour into embrasures and ventilation shafts. The bunkers, once thought unassailable, became death traps. Heat rolling through them, smoke choking the air, steel glowing with unbearable heat. Even soldiers untouched by the flames often broke and ran, the terror of being burned alive overwhelming all discipline. Worse still were the grenades packed with white phosphorus. When thrown into a confined space, the chemical burst into a blinding flare, its fragments sticking to whatever they touched. White phosphorus did not extinguish itself. It burned until it consumed everything. Arms experts would later describe it clinically. The substance could burn down to the bone. But in the chaos of June 6th, it was not science, it was horror. Men who had braced themselves against bullets and shells found themselves facing an enemy that seemed almost elemental. Fire itself turned into a weapon. The Allies had learned from bitter experience. At places like Tarawa and Salerno, bunkers had cost countless lives. Now, they used flame and phosphorus to reduce strong points swiftly, leaving no chance for defenders to recover. To the Americans fighting their way inland, these weapons were tools of survival. To the Germans trapped in their concrete shelters, they were symbols of inevitability. The realization that technology and resources had tilted far beyond their favor. Inside the bunkers, the air grew unbreathable. The smell of scorched concrete and seared earth clung to everything. Some defenders tried to fight on, firing blindly through smoke. Others crawled out with their hands raised, faces streaked with soot, eyes hollow with shock. A few never emerged at all. In that moment, the myth of the Atlantic Wall shattered. The fortresses that had been hailed as unbreakable were undone not by siege, but by fire. Swift, merciless, and absolute. By mid-morning, the weight of the invasion had crushed the defenses at Utah Beach. The German machine guns that had rattled so furiously at dawn fell silent, their barrels warped with heat, their gunners dead, wounded, or scattered. Mortar crews, cut down by naval shells or pinned beneath burning bunkers, could no longer respond. The carefully prepared obstacles, the mines, the stakes, the barbed wire, had slowed the first waves but not stopped them. Now, they were little more than debris beneath the boots of advancing infantry. The Americans moved with momentum that seemed unstoppable. Tanks rumbled ashore, their treads grinding across the sand and up through the dunes, belching smoke as they forced paths inland. Engineers cleared lanes through minefields, marking the safe passages with tape and stakes. Behind them, waves of fresh troops surged forward, each landing craft disgorging more men than the one before. For the German defenders, cohesion unraveled. Some fought on in small knots, retreating from position to position, firing until their ammunition ran dry. Others broke and fled, seeking cover in the flooded fields or hedgerows behind the beach. Communications had collapsed. Radios were dead. Telephone lines cut by paratroopers during the night. Orders from higher command never reached the front. In their absence, soldiers acted on instinct, some defiant, others resigned, many simply terrified. By noon, it was clear to both sides that Utah Beach belonged to the Allies. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had once promised would hold back the tide, had cracked wide open. German soldiers who had spent months pouring concrete and stringing wire now watched as those same defenses were reduced to smoldering rubble. The battle was no longer about defending the shoreline. It was about survival, retreat, and delaying the inevitable. And yet, even in defeat, the German defenders did not vanish without cost. Every machine gun nest overrun, every bunker cleared, had taken lives. For the Americans storming the beach, the victory was paid in blood. For the Germans, the collapse was bitter proof that no amount of courage could balance the scales against overwhelming numbers and firepower. Utah Beach was only one piece of the puzzle, one corner of the vast invasion. But its fall symbolized something larger, the shattering of the illusion that Fortress Europe could endure. What had been promised as an unbreakable shield was, in truth, only a fragile wall, crumbling under the sheer force of history. Utah was only one fragment of the colossal invasion. To the east and west, 4 more beaches erupted into chaos, each with its own story of struggle, loss, and survival. At Sword Beach, the British faced a duel not only with the sea, but with the sky. In the hours before dawn, paratroopers had already descended behind German lines, capturing key bridges and crossroads. By the time the first landing craft ground against the shore, the defenders were already caught in a vice. Fire from the front and disruption in their rear. German strong points fired as long as they could, but the British advance pressed relentlessly inland. The weight of the airborne troops made it clear. The beach could not be held. At Gold Beach, German soldiers found themselves shattered before they could properly fight. The aerial bombardment that morning was devastating. Bunkers collapsed in thunderous roars, trenches caved in, and machine guns were buried under rubble. The defenders who survived the bombardment tried to resist, but they were crushed within the first hour. For them, the fight had ended before it truly began. At Juno Beach, the Canadians faced one of the most determined defenses. Machine gun fire scythed through the first waves, and the surf ran red. But the Canadians fought with ferocity born of long preparation. They clawed their way inland, village by village, hedgerow by hedgerow. By day's end, not only had they secured their objectives, but they had advanced farther inland than any other Allied force. For the German defenders, the realization was crushing. The invaders were not only breaking through, they were surging deep into France. And then there was Omaha, a name that would burn itself into history. Here, the German defenses were strongest, their bunkers built dangerously close to the shoreline, commanding a deadly view of the sand. The first waves of Americans faced slaughter, pinned down by fire with nowhere to hide. For hours, the outcome teetered in the balance. German gunners, exhausted but resolute, poured bullets into the killing ground. Yet even at Omaha, numbers told. The tide of men was endless. Inch by inch, through smoke and blood, the Americans clawed their way up the bluffs. By evening, even this most ferocious of defenses had been overrun. Each beach had its own rhythm, its own tempo of collapse. At some, resistance was shattered almost instantly. At others, the defenders fought until their weapons failed and their positions burned. But everywhere, the same truth unfolded. The Atlantic Wall, so proudly proclaimed as unbreakable, was falling in pieces. For the German soldiers who survived those hours, the memory was one of chaos and futility. The beaches were lost, the Allies were inland, and the war, though far from over, had shifted decisively. When the smoke cleared over the beaches of Normandy, not every German soldier lay dead among the ruins. Thousands were taken prisoner, young conscripts, wounded veterans, and foreign auxiliaries who had been pressed into service under the Reich's banner. Their stories reveal not only military defeat, but the unraveling of belief. Helmut Romer was one of them. After hiding for 36 hours in a trench with comrades who had neither food nor hope, he finally emerged, weapon discarded, hands raised. "We were exhausted," he later recalled. "We decided to hand ourselves over to the British." His words carried no bitterness, only the simple truth of men who had reached the limit of endurance. Hunger, fear, and the endless bombardments had drained every last drop of resolve. For soldiers like Romer, surrender was not only survival, it was relief. The Atlantic Wall, once hailed as impregnable, had proved itself little more than propaganda. The reality had been concrete bunkers collapsing under naval shells, fields aflame with phosphorus, comrades torn apart in seconds. Against such power, what could any soldier truly do? Prisoners were marched down the beaches they had once sworn to defend. Some limped, their uniforms scorched and tattered. Others clutched at bandaged arms or carried comrades too weak to walk. Allied soldiers searched them for weapons, then herded them toward holding areas where the captured and the wounded mingled in a haze of exhaustion. Among them were the Osttruppen, the forced conscripts from the east. For many of these men, capture was almost liberation. Stripped of their German uniforms, they spoke in Russian, Polish, or Georgian, explaining to bewildered Allied guards that they had never fought willingly for the Reich. Some even volunteered information, desperate to prove they were not true enemies. In these moments, the great myths of Nazi invincibility crumbled as swiftly as the bunkers. The Reich had promised its soldiers glory. Instead, it gave them starvation, broken weapons, and an unwinnable battle. The sight of columns of prisoners shuffling inland was as much a symbol of collapse as the Allied tanks grinding across the Norman fields. For the defenders, surrender was the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. They had survived the beaches, but now faced years of captivity, uncertainty, and reflection on a war that had swallowed their youth and left them empty-handed. Far from the beaches, in the quiet chambers of his Bavarian retreat, Adolf Hitler awoke to the news of the invasion hours after it had begun. The greatest amphibious assault in history was already underway, yet the Führer, commander of a vast empire at war, had slept through its opening act. When aides finally delivered the reports, his reaction was not one of despair, but of grim satisfaction. The uncertainty was over. For months, he had obsessed over when and where the Allies would strike. Now the veil was lifted, and he convinced himself that clarity alone gave Germany an advantage. At last, he's reported to have said, the Allies have chosen to meet their fate. In his mind, the Wehrmacht would drive them back into the sea, just as he had dreamed in countless speeches. Yet this optimism was less strategy than delusion. Hitler clung to the belief that the landings at Normandy were only a feint, a diversion meant to disguise the true invasion at Calais. This was not merely a miscalculation, it was the poisoned fruit of Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception that had planted false signals, fake armies, and fabricated intelligence to mislead German command. Even as thousands of Allied troops fought their way across the beaches, Hitler insisted the decisive blow was still to come elsewhere. The dissonance between reality and Hitler's perception widened with every passing hour. Reports from the coast painted a picture of disaster. Bunkers silenced, tanks bogged down, communications in shambles. Yet within the Reich's upper circles, fear of contradicting the Führer silenced truth. Officers softened their language, framed setbacks as temporary, and clung to the hope that reinforcements could yet be unleashed. The result was paralysis. While Allied forces poured inland, German armored divisions remained idle, waiting for orders from a man convinced the real invasion had not yet arrived. Hitler's delay in unleashing them sealed the fate of Normandy. For the soldiers who had fought and bled on the beaches, the thought that their leaders had hesitated, had misunderstood the very battle they were dying in, was a cruel irony. While they endured fire and phosphorus, hunger and terror, their supreme commander clung to illusions. On June 6th, history had already turned. But in Hitler's mind, victory was still possible. That gulf between fantasy and reality would define the last desperate year of the Reich. The fall of the Atlantic Wall was not due to brute force alone. Behind the armada of ships and the storm of paratroopers lay one of the most ambitious deception campaigns in military history, Operation Fortitude. Its purpose was simple: to convince Hitler and his generals that the true invasion would strike not at Normandy, but at Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. The Allies understood that German intelligence was formidable, so they fed it carefully constructed lies. Inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft were assembled in English fields, photographed from the air, and left to be discovered. Fake radio traffic mimicked entire divisions where none existed. Even General George S. Patton, widely feared and respected by the Germans, was placed in command of this phantom army, lending the illusion credibility. To German spies, it seemed obvious. Patton's forces would cross at Calais. Normandy was too distant, too risky, too lightly defended to be the real target. The deception worked beyond all expectation. On the morning of June 6th, as men died on the sands of Omaha and Utah, German commanders still believed they were facing only the opening act of a much larger assault. Rundstedt hesitated, Rommel was absent, and Hitler clung stubbornly to the belief that Normandy was a diversion. In truth, the Allies had achieved what every strategist dreams of, not only surprising their enemy, but paralyzing him with doubt. This paralysis cost the Germans precious hours. Armored divisions that might have rolled toward the beaches remained idle, waiting for confirmation of a phantom invasion that would never come. By the time Hitler finally released them, the Allies had already dug in, their beachheads linked and supplied, their foothold secure. Operation Fortitude did more than trick the German high command. It deepened the sense of betrayal and futility among the soldiers who fought on the front lines. Many later recalled bitterly that they had been sacrificed while reinforcements sat motionless miles away, all because their leaders were chasing shadows. Deception had tilted the battlefield before the first shot was fired. By turning Hitler's paranoia against him, the Allies ensured that when the tide of war broke upon Normandy, it would not be met by Germany's full strength, but by hesitation, division, and disbelief. Behind every bunker and rifle barrel on June 6th stood a human being caught in the machinery of history. It is easy to imagine the German defenders as a faceless enemy, shadows in gray uniforms firing from the dunes. But many of these men were scarcely more than boys. Some were veterans maimed on the Eastern Front and deemed unfit for mobile warfare, sent here to watch and wait. Others were conscripts, barely trained, thrust into the uniform of a regime they had little love for. And then there were the Osttruppen, the Eastern troops, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, and Georgians who had once fought against Germany only to be captured, pressed into service, and shipped hundreds of miles from their homelands. Their fate was a cruel paradox. Men who had resisted Nazi rule now forced to defend it. Many could not even understand the orders barked at them, yet they were chained to the same destiny as their German comrades. Hunger hollowed their faces. For weeks before the invasion, rations had dwindled, and many lived on watery soup or bread so stale it cracked teeth. Sleep came in broken fragments, disturbed by the rumble of Allied bombers overhead, or the ceaseless labor of shoring up defenses. Letters from home carried news of bombings in German cities, families scattered, loved ones lost. For the soldiers on the Atlantic Wall, there was no illusion of glory, only the grinding realization that they were both protectors and prisoners. When the invasion came, they were asked to hold back an army that outnumbered them, outgunned them, and outsupplied them by magnitudes. Some obeyed out of discipline, others out of fear, and some simply because there was no way to run. Those who survived the bombardments and flamethrowers emerged half-blind from smoke-filled bunkers, ears ringing, hands trembling. They had fought, but what they fought for seemed to dissolve with every Allied tank that rolled ashore. The human cost of D-Day is usually counted in Allied sacrifice. Thousands dead and wounded in the surf. Yet on the other side, there were also boys who would never see their families again, conscripts who had no choice in the uniform they wore, and veterans who gave their last strength in a hopeless defense. Their suffering, though tied to a criminal regime, was no less real. For these men, the tragedy of Normandy was not only defeat, but the cruel knowledge that they had been placed on the wrong side of history, trapped in a battle they could not win, for a cause many did not believe in. By the evening of June 6th, the Atlantic Wall was no longer a fortress. It was a ruin. Its bunkers stood cracked and smoking, its minefields torn open by engineers, its barbed wire flattened beneath tank treads. The Germans had fought, and some had fought desperately, but they had been asked to hold back a tide that no wall of concrete or steel could withstand. The fall of Normandy marked more than just a military defeat. It shattered the myth of invincibility that the Reich had built around itself. Hitler had boasted that Fortress Europe would never be breached. In less than a day, the Allies had torn that boast to pieces. The illusion of German strength, already frayed by years of war, collapsed fully on those beaches. For the defenders who survived, the legacy was bitter. Some went into captivity, spending years behind Allied wire, left to reflect on a war that had stolen their youth. Others died anonymously in the surf, their bodies mingling with those of the men they had been ordered to kill. Many were remembered not as individuals, but as part of a faceless enemy swept aside by history. Yet when we peel back the layers of ideology and propaganda, we find a human story that resists silence. The men in those bunkers were not monoliths of evil. They were a spectrum, believers and doubters, veterans and conscripts, Germans and foreigners pressed into service. They were men trapped by circumstance, fighting in the wrong place for the wrong cause, against an enemy too vast to resist. D-Day has long been remembered as the dawn of liberation, the beginning of the end for Nazi rule in Europe. But for those on the other side, it was twilight, the fading of an empire that had demanded everything and promised only ruin in return. The fall of the Atlantic Wall was not just a military collapse. It was the crumbling of a vision built on fear, domination, and delusion. In the end, the defenders of Normandy leave us a haunting reminder. Wars are not fought only by those who believe in them. They are fought also by the hungry, the coerced, the disillusioned, and the afraid. And when history's tide comes crashing in, it consumes them all the same.